Good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. It's a pleasure to welcome you and thank you all for being here today. Before we begin, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Iryna Skubii, and I am the inaugural Mykola Zerov Fellow in Ukrainian Studies at the University of Melbourne and the President of Ukrainian Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand. I am joining here from the University of Melbourne, situated on the unceded lands of the traditional owners on which we work, learn, and live, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, Woiwurrung nations, Yorta Yorta nation, and Daja Daja Wurrung people, and I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Today's webinar is organized as a part of the continuing cooperation between the Ukrainian Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand and the Research Initiative on Post-Soviet Space at the University of Melbourne. It's convened by its two directors, Professor Mark Edele and Associate Professor Julie Feder. This fruitful collaboration has already produced several events, some of which you may attended in previous years, including the four-part series Ukraine Writes Back, Writers, Poets, and the War. Recordings of these events and today's webinar will be available on the Faculty of Arts YouTube page, where RIPSS has its own collection, and we will share the links with you shortly. The theme of our today's book presentation webinar series is Thinking and Writing about Ukraine in a Turbulent World. The idea of this series of events was to go beyond academic environment and discuss the most important topics of Ukraine's present history and its place in the global world. When we first envisioned the series a few months ago, the idea was to keep attention on Ukraine and to reflect on the changes in writing and thinking about war, about Ukraine, and particularly in the current context. But today, a few months later, while Ukraine continues to resist Russian aggression, Ukraine's experience and expertise in military social resilience in 21st century warfare have become, unfortunately, urgently relevant. And Ukraine's and wider region of Eastern Europe have gained increasing importance in world affairs and in understanding moments of rupture, crisis, democracy, military and cyber warfare, ecological catastrophes, and questions of culture, heritage, and its protection. We have been very fortunate to assemble an extraordinary list of authors whose books have already become highlights of this year. And in addition to Serhii Plokhy, who is opening the series today, this webinar will feature Oля Hercules, Daria Cymbaluk, Ulrich Schmidt, and Alessandro Acili. And the webinars will continue to be organized until October this year. So please follow RIPSS and USAANZ social media pages to learn more about our upcoming events. And we are especially honored today to be joined by His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko, Ambassador of Ukraine to Australia and New Zealand, who will offer his opening remarks very shortly. And he is very supportive of various events of Ukrainian studies at the University of Melbourne. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Professor Serhii Plokhy is a Mikhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University and one of the world's leading historians of Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe. He served as director of Harvard Ukraine Research Institute from 2013 to 2025. His books won numerous awards, including the Lionel Herbert Prize for Best English language book on international relations, Taras Shevchenko National Prize, the Bailey Guilford Prize, and Pushkin House Prize, as well as Duke Ehrenburg Prize in European History for his Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History. Professor Mark Edele is a Hansen Professor in History at the University of Melbourne, a historian of Soviet Union and its successor states, especially Russia, and he is the author of also numerous influential books, including Stalinist Society, Stalinist Defectors, Russia's War Against Ukraine, The Whole Story, and he is also one of the editors of Elements in Soviet and Post-Soviet History with Cambridge University Press. His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko has served as ambassador to Ukraine of Ukraine to Australia since April 2022. Before joining the Foreign Office, he was active in business and civil society and was co-founder of Ukraine's Crisis Media Center. He also served as an advisor of the Minister of Defense of Ukraine in 2022 and is currently a member of the Supervisory Board of Ukrainian Institute. So it's now my great pleasure to invite His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko to open the webinar series, after which Professor Edele will be in conversation with our distinguished guest, Professor Serhii Plokhy. And I also wanted to remind the audience that you are welcome to post your questions in Q&A session, and they will be answered during conversation later. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Skubii, and congratulations on launching the series. And it's a great honor for me to offer some opening remarks for this lecture today. And it's been immense pleasure for me personally to be collaborating with the University of Melbourne, as well as all the Ukrainians based and academics who are in Australia and New Zealand. And we have engaged for the past 4 years. So it's great to see another product, which is the series, these lectures. And for me personally, I'm very pleased that we start with Professor Serhii Plokhy. We met personally actually 11 years ago, just thinking about it, when I was visiting Boston in 2015. And then we've seen each other several times in Kiev during his trips. And the importance of the series and importance of what Professor Plokhy is doing, it cannot be underestimated. It's extremely important in the understanding, or actually promoting the understanding of the reasons behind Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Every time I do a talk at the university or for any audience in Australia, I always refer to history, trying to explain how it all started from a historical point of view and why it's so important for the audiences in Australia, in America, anywhere in the world who don't know much about Ukraine, why it's so important to look into the historical context of what has happened in the 20th century, what has happened a century before, and how history and why history matters so much. Also, in my observations and kind of in my work, I have studied quite a bit of how Russians have been using history as a weapon, basically weaponization of history, and how the historical narrative has been used by Russian government to justify its war in Ukraine. Well, certainly we all know the medieval story of Kievan Rus and how Russians have used that part of history to justify the fact that Ukraine is not really a country and it's all been Russia, and et cetera, et cetera. It's been quite elaborated by Vladimir Putin in his long essay, which he published in 2021. Also, the fact how he has used a figure of Volodymyr, who was the one who baptized Kievan Rus, and he erected a monument in Moscow in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, and how he's used history to weaponize the narrative, or actually use it for their domestic propaganda, but also external propaganda. We also see quite a lot how Kremlin is using the history of World War II and the narratives of the World War II and the trauma that all the people of the former Soviet Union feel with the World War II, but how the modern day regime is using that historical part to justify Russia's war against the Nazi who are running Ukraine, trying to dehumanize Ukrainians out there. And of course, it's very easy to play with that narrative because all the people of the Soviet Union have grown up with that trauma of the Second World War, and it's very emotional, it's very personal, and et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, we see why history matters and how history could be also weaponized for justifying Russia's war in Ukraine. Therefore, it's extremely important to study history, to understand it. It will give you an additional context. And of course, Professor Plokhy has written extensively on this subject. And today he will be presenting his book, David Against the Goliath, and his writings on the Russian-Ukrainian war, explaining this and other concepts and issues that we are currently facing. As you know, the war is still ongoing. There is no end to it, and as it's on 5th year of this war, it's now an existential war for Ukraine because it's a matter of our survival. and it's also an existential war for the Putin's regime, who cannot last if this war is over. So we are in a very difficult situation at the moment. Of course, that's a whole new lecture and a whole new talk, and I will just conclude my remarks here. I wish you a great discussion, and certainly I would like to pass the floor to Professor Plokhy for his lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and welcome, Serhii.
Hello, hi everyone, and thank you so much for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be on this platform to have this discussion. I wish I could be there in person, but let's use whatever technology we have to really do this travel in not only in space but also in time. It's evening here. It's April 15th, and you have already April 16th. That's what I hear.
Yes, you're looking into the future by talking to us. Yes,
exactly. Exactly.
So we will be talking for about 40 minutes or so, and for the audience after that conversation, we'll have a wider discussion, including your questions. If you could use the Q&A function in the Zoom, that will bring your questions up on my screen, and I can then select them. We will be talking about Serhii's newest book, David versus Goliath, which collects his writings of the first 2 years and the immediately prior to Russia's war against Ukraine. And we have a series of topics we want to discuss, and we'll see how far we get with all of them in the 40 minutes we have been allocated. So the first thing, Serhii, I would like to talk about is what it is like to write about the present as a historian. This is kind of a heretical behavior both you and I engage in. Many of our colleagues would think that presentism is the biggest sin of a historian. And in particular, of course, once you enter the sort of space of op-ed writing, commentary, and conversations with journalists, you will also often be asked about the future, which is an even greater heresy for historians. So I would like to invite you to share some of your thoughts, worries, and reflections on writing about the present and at times the future as a historian.
Yes, I certainly agree. It's really a capital crime almost for historians to do what we are doing. And in my defense, I didn't decide to do that on my own. I blame the journalists. And the book that we're presenting today, David and Goliath, there are some of my short writings, but most of that are interviews. And really, it's them who are mostly responsible for this sins that I'm engaged in as a historian. It's for me, it's mostly this extraordinary circumstances. It's the war, the big war in particular on Russia and Ukraine, that really made not me, but probably people of other professions to think about what can they do, how they can help, how they can be part of the events, how they can help to shape those events. And interviews and op-eds as well is one way to do that. But eventually, I also recognize that that particular genre, it has its limits. And apart from doing interviews and op-eds, I also authored 2 books at this point on this war. One is the Russo-Ukrainian War, and another, the title is Chernobyl Roulette. That's on the Russian occupation of Chernobyl nuclear site. And it's really, really very very unusual experience was for me, working on those books, but also engaging with interviews. We as historians are trained to work on the study of the processes that have beginning and end. And to me, we are a little bit like a student in a school who tries to solve equation, but the answer is at the back. And you can cheat and go to the back and see what the answer is, and then you try to solve that equation. So we know the outcome as historians. We know the result. And that knowledge really empowers us and makes our judgments and our research powerful, interesting, and really we can provide the perspective that the people that are in the midst of the events, they can't provide it, they don't have it, they don't have this understanding. So that's the value, that's added value that we bring to the table. When we don't know the end, that's really a terrifying experience. You really lose your ground. That's not what you were trained to do. You also go into the areas where you're not supposed to go. You also deal with the very specific question. For example, you're writing today, and you check the news, and there is a statement by President Trump, for example. And that statement says that this night there will be the end of civilization, the end of the world. And you think, okay, that's extremely important statement and extremely important development. And then you wake up tomorrow and there is another statement which says that, okay, there will be no the end of the world and there will be something else. So even looking at what is important, what is not important in the real time, and then putting that into the interview, into the book that will be there 2 years, 3 years from now, maybe longer, that's a challenge that we historians, when we work in our sphere, we normally don't have. We also have really limited but still quite significant access to the sources. If you work on the war, you probably want to know the both sides, the story coming from both sides. And it's almost impossible. The archives are not there yet. If they're there, they're not open. And you realize that the source base that you use is extremely limited. You also realize that 5, 10, 15 years from now, there will be another generation of historians who will have this access to the sources. And every single historian will make a point saying how smart they are and how limited you were.
By showing how Plokhy was wrong, yes.
Really, you sacrifice yourself. You know that will be something that others will be attacking it, and so these are all limitations of our profession, of our training, but also of the sort of things that we can do now with the sources that we have. There is one plus that I want to mention that I didn't know when I started doing that. And it is related to the sources. What I did, I discovered a sort of the really the throw of the sources for which historians working on the earlier periods probably would kill for. That set of sources is called social media, when you can really take in real time people's thoughts, people's emotions, and that's something that anyone studying the history 10 years before today or something like that source is simply not there, and it really the only thing that really compensates for all the deficiencies that otherwise our source base has. And in terms of compensation, kind of a moral compensation, and this dispensation of the sins, I think that's really where we as historians we have really particular function to perform in the society. And one of those functions is that we really have to provide what in Harvard logo, the Harvard's motto rather, calls good knowledge, especially in this age of social media and fake news and things like that. So keep the world to certain standards when it comes to history, but also to provide a historical perspective of the events of today, which means really helping people that are in the midst of the events to really acquire on their own, but with our helps, meaning, understand the meaning of what is happening, understand the stakes that are there. So that's the challenges, and at the end, the rewards or sort of rewards that I encountered or saw in this really traveling outside of the crossing the borders of profession, not just any particular field, but also crossing the borders of profession.
Yeah. A follow-up to that, and one of the perils, of course, of writing about the present is that as the present moves to become history, one is likely to be wrong, particularly with one's predictions. And one of the, I think, beautiful things about this book is that you have not edited yourself. So you haven't taken out your previous statements if you later then felt they were maybe inaccurate to some extent. Can you talk a little bit about how your thinking on Russia's war against Ukraine has changed during those, since the beginning of the war, or actually since the immediate eve of the war?
Sure. I edited, but I edited mostly for repetition, especially when it comes to interviews, because quite often it's the same sort of questions, and you really after some period of time just run out of vocabulary to describe the same sort of a thought in with different words in different ways. But I kept my opinions at the time and mistakes at the time intact, and that's where really historian was speaking in me. The appreciation of the really the source that comes from a particular place in a particular time and reflects the horizon of expectations of the particular time. So I look at that also as not just about as a publication of my particular takes on the war, but also as a artifact of a particular time. Now, where I didn't get it right, and probably if I would have a different approach to editing, I would maybe edit this out. One thing I can tell you right away, for example, the book on the war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, the subtitle is The Return of History. If I would publish it now, I would give a subtitle something about the origins of the war. But in my mind, as a historian, the title or subtitle of Origins deserves something really big and huge. And when I started working on the book in March of 2022, I expected that the war probably would be over by summer. That it's a very important development, but looking at the history of the wars in post-Soviet space, in particular Georgia, the annexation of the Crimea, I really thought that I would write not just the beginning of the war, but also the end of the war by the time I was there. And it turned out to be the largest war in Europe since 1945. I would say the largest war in the world since World War II. Regular war, traditional warfare. Certainly the largest war of the 21st century. That deserves 12 books with the title or subtitle Origins. So that's one thing that certainly was not there at the very start, at the very beginning. And another thing was that looking at the war from the perspective of 2022, I really overestimated the importance or the strength of the Western unity. Because the war by summer of 2022, it really brought the United States and Europe together. They were not together for a long period of time before that. They were not together at the start of the war. Somewhere by May or June of 2022, there was really the return of the Western alliance. And I really didn't count on the United States really changing its mind and really, if not entirely, then significantly, certainly weakening the alliance itself. And we are talking today the level of the crisis in relations, transatlantic relations, is even getting deeper with every passing day. So that is something that I really took for granted. I didn't think that would change. These are the big maybe surprises that came after I completed writing the book the way how it is now. And in the interviews again, they go beyond 2022. They go all the way in 24, if I'm not mistaken. So you can see more in dynamic my attempt to talk about the war and bring the historical perspective and try to really explain what the war means for me from that perspective. And the general framework in which I look at this war, it didn't change. I don't think it will change. I look at this war as one of the many wars, despite it being big, unique, and so on and so forth, but one of many wars that really accompany the process of disintegration of empires. And that gives me long-term optimism. The story of empires is really not only decline and not only wars, but eventually disintegration of empires. And that story is also about the rise of independent states, which, again, that's where my historical optimism about this war comes, despite the fact that it goes now into the 5th year. The destruction, the level of destruction grows, and the price that Ukraine in particular is paying for that is, of course, enormous and keeps growing.
Yes, thank you. So there's a whole range of things we can follow up on. One of them is the origins of the war. One of them is the potential future of what this war will do. And another one, which I want to begin with, because I have as a scholar, a particularly personal investment in it, is the question of the term and the concept of post-Soviet. Now, I have a nearly institutional investment in this term because I'm one of the conveners of the research initiative on post-Soviet space, right? So it's in the title of that thing. It's in the title of a journal that Julie Fedor edits, coming out of Melbourne, and it is in the title of the book series I edit with Rebecca Friedman with Cambridge University Press. So I'm sort of deeply enmeshed in this concept. You just used this concept for the post-Soviet space, and you use it repeatedly throughout the book, both in spatial terms as the region that was formerly dominated by or ruled by the Soviet Union. But you also use it at times in a temporal sense of the post-Soviet period. There is significant criticism of this term from many colleagues. And in particular, I think the sense is that using post-Soviet, particularly in a spatial term, sort of reifies and naturalizes the claims Russia is making on this post-Soviet space. So I would like, and there are some very interesting moments in the book. There's one interviewer who directly asks you about this, but there's other moments as well. So I would like to get your sense on the utility and the pitfalls of this term, both in temporal and spatial terms.
Yes, I use this term, and I find it useful for a number of things. First of all, as I just talked about that, my perspective on the war is that this is a war of disintegration of empire. And in that sense, of course, the empire I'm talking about is the Russian Empire that in the latest incarnation is the Soviet Union. And it is the war very much, in my interpretation, over the control of the post-Soviet space. The Soviet Union was dissolved in December of 91, immediately or within 1 week after Ukraine's vote for independence. And any attempt for Russia to bring back control over the post-Soviet space depends on what happens to Ukraine, the second largest post-Soviet republics. So to a degree that history and historians can help to understand this war, I think that the concept of post-Soviet is absolutely necessary. It's very useful. We can get around and use different terms, but the concept itself, the idea itself, I think it's extremely useful. It's useful in this case. It's not useful in some other cases because the post-Soviet space is undergoing, including during this war, the process of disintegration. And we certainly talk about Baltic states in a very different way how we talk about Central Asia. There are some similarities linked to the Soviet period and to the Soviet past, but there are also huge differences. And these differences, and I'm taking just Central Asia and Baltic states as an example. We can talk about other parts of the former Soviet Union as well. But the differences are, and this is very interesting, they're linked not only to what is happening today and the trajectory for the future, they also link to a deeper history than Soviet history, right? So we in this sense, we should really bring in, and it can be useful, the history of Austria-Hungary when it comes to Ukraine, to history of interwar Romania when it comes to Moldova, to history of Sweden when it comes to the Baltic states, and Russian-British rivalry in the Great Game again would be also not out of place there. So in that sense, post-Soviet is one of useful terms. It should be used. The problem is actually not to close any other perspectives. Is using of this term, not to overdo that, not to get defensive, and talk about this as basically one very useful perspective. And again, especially important it for bringing in historical knowledge and historical analysis into the understanding of today's developments.
Thank you. The second point I want to follow up on is on the origins. I mean, you've already spoken of this as one of the essentially the biggest war of the post-Soviet succession, right? If we want to put it that way. There is a fairly widespread notion, which I think has lost a little bit in attraction in the last couple of years, but was fairly strong when that war started, and that is the kind of it's NATO's fault thesis, prominently connected to international relations scholar John Mersheimer from my alma mater, the University of Chicago, but also embraced by many others, and not only IR scholars, also some colleagues in the history profession have embraced that thesis. What I would, and you do not actually in your writings let NATO off the hook, but it is in the other direction, I think. So the Mersheimer thesis, it's the West's fault because the West encroached on NATO encroached on Russia's sort of natural sphere of influence, and therefore it had to react aggressively. How far would you go to put that on its head, namely to say NATO is at fault, NATO and the EU is at fault insofar as they have been way too timid to embrace Ukraine as part of the European space and the Euro-Atlantic space. That is EU and NATO, right?
Yes, thank you. First about Mersheimer, I occasionally defend him, especially in front of the Ukrainian audience, where the argument is that Mersheimer is anti-Ukrainian. And I met him personally, and I know his writings, and this is the same Mersheimer who back in the 1990s was saying that there was a huge mistake to do nuclear disarmament of Ukraine. One of our few voices who was saying that, and I think that he was right back in the 1990s. And he is wrong now after 2022, and he is wrong because he is really not particularly trying to defend Russia, attack the West or Ukraine. He works within the paradigm of the realpolitik and great powers, taking away agency from non-great powers. And this is a flawed approach, which was very popular. Again, Kissinger was a big, of course, figure in that field. So he changed his mind on Ukraine eventually. But the idea that great power politics analysis doesn't explain the fall of the Soviet Union. It doesn't explain the fall of empires, which is, in my opinion, the biggest geopolitical, not tragedy, but the development of the 20th century anywhere in the world. So Mersheimer and his approach has nothing to offer in that regard. And that is true also for NATO, because it's not NATO. Anyone who studied history of the NATO expansion knows that initiative didn't come from Washington or from Bonn or Western capitals. That was the choice, that was the initiative of the smaller countries that don't exist in Mersheimer's worldview. Places like Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia that were knocking on the door and were told no, and they were knocking on the door again and again. So if you look at history of the event, it's not West moving East, it's East moving West, running away from the former imperial master. So that is my at least take on the Mersheimer argument. And when you look at the start of the war in 2014, immediately after the Revolution of Dignity, Maidan protests in Ukraine, it starts in response to Ukraine really insisting on signing association agreement with European Union, not with NATO. Not joining European Union. It's about really liberating itself from the embrace of Eurasian Union. So that's again in terms of my critique of that particular approach. In terms of the where the West is, I think a much stronger argument can be made where West made a huge mistake. It would be close to the Mearsheimer of 1994 about the disarmament, nuclear disarmament of Ukraine, because what happened at that time was that the West, and more specifically the United States, disarmed Ukraine and left the entire area, Ukraine, by taking away nuclear weapons, it created a power vacuum that traditionally really attracts aggression. So, and offered the Budapest Memorandum, and even that they didn't offer. Ukrainians insisted on that, so they had to give that. So when they put together general statements from the United Nations documents and called it assurances. And really didn't produce anything that could replace the power of deterrence that nuclear weapons have in this world. And once Russia started go outside of the borders of Russian Federation, first the war in Chechnya was forgiven. And the war in Georgia was forgiven and rewarded with Nord Stream 1. Annexation of the Crimea was forgiven and rewarded with Nord Stream 2. The term for that is appeasement. If the Budapest Memorandum is more like a mistake, more like a sort of classic Western policies where the people think that make decisions in terms of the electoral cycles, not long term. So the policy of Nord Streams and really awarding Russia for aggression, that's a classic appeasement of the 1930s. And my personal belief is that if Russia would get the sort of response to Georgia that it got after Crimea with some form of sanctions, there would be no Crimea. If Russia after Crimea got the sanctions that it got in 2022, there would be no 2022. And if US and the West would provide Ukraine with the weapons in 2022 and 2023 that Ukraine needed when Russian defenses started to fall, there would be no attacks on NATO today. So it looks like that idea is probably less controversial now in Europe than it was in 2022, 23, and 24. But that's the how I look at that as a historian, knowing the story of appeasement of 1930s, but also looking at what is happening in front of our eyes. It's escalation. It's one escalation after another, and the idea that some sort of appeasement, some sort of concessions, territorial or otherwise, at the expense of Ukraine, would stop the aggression. By now, it looks like even politicians understand that this is, or at least in Europe, not in the United States, at least European politicians understand that this is a mirage. This is not real.
I would like to move to, let me just remind the audience that if you have questions, you can already post them. So we have them already ready for the second part in the Q&A. There are none yet, I can see. So you can already formulate your questions now if you like. So I would like to move into even more hazardous terrain, namely talking about the future rather than the present, or rather talking about the present as a moment in a in a larger geopolitical development moving to some sort of yet unknown future. And that is the role of this war in the kind of large geopolitical reshaping we find ourselves in at the moment. In both your book on the war and in several of the contributions to this new collection of your writings, your interpretation seems to be that we're essentially moving to a new kind of Cold War, a bipolar world order, where you have a confrontation between the United States and its allies on the one hand, and China and its allies on the other, and Russia is essentially reduced to a vassal state, to put it most bluntly, of China. While Ukraine would be part of the Western alliance in that confrontation. An alternative reading is that we are actually seeing a move to a much more multipolar world order, where middle powers will play a much more important role, with the two real great powers being China and the United States, flanked by the next, rising great power, which is India, while a lot of the action is actually happening in a third space, and that is of both democratic and autocratic middle powers. And Russia, particularly because it failed in its bid to reestablish itself as a great power by taking over Ukraine, finds itself reduced to one of the middle powers, which it might actually find much more difficult to navigate than it thought that world would be. So I would like to get your kind of thoughts on which of those scenarios are we likely to be moving to?
Yes, thank you. My argument about growing tendency for bipolarity was formulated in 2022 with really reestablishing and strengthening the transatlantic alliance between the United States and Europe. And now we are in 2026, and transatlantic alliance, as I suggested and as we all know and see, going through basically an existential crisis. On the other hand, the idea that China would be one of the poles of that bipolar world, that tendency is strengthening, and Russia becomes weaker and more dependent on China. So we have really this strengthening of the Chinese pole in the potentially bipolar world, and we have really on the verge of disintegration of another pole, and the United States refusing to play the role of the pole in that structure. So I am not prepared yet to say that this bipolarity, the idea of bipolarity that I talked about and wrote about later, is dead. Mid-term, not even long-term, but mid-term and long-term at the same time, I think that in competition with China, the United States have nowhere to go but to Europe. And I foresee significant correction to the American foreign policy, if not after the elections in the fall of this year, then certainly with the change of president in the White House. So we will see how it will go. Now, with regard to Russia, one of the ways how I explain the Russian this imperial syndrome or post-imperial attempts to reestablish control over the post-Soviet space is that Russia wanted to emerge as one of the centers in the multipolar world. And so being able to compete on the one hand with China, on the other hand with European Union. So European Union is still there. China is growing. Russia is actually, its role is diminishing, and it becomes more and more dependent on China. So the Russian ambition of being one of the poles in multipolar world, where at least in Eurasia there are three main centers, are not only problematic today, I think that actually they will be problematic for the next at least few decades as well. If we imagine the world where there are not, it's not the multipolar in terms of the multipolar world of before World War I, where there are not 5 or 6 centers, but 20, then certainly Russia will be one of them. But if it's a limited group of the poles in the world, Russia certainly, with this war, undermined its chances to perform the function that it wanted to perform. I don't expect also, like the American turn away from Europe, the Russian turn toward China to be absolutely permanent. I think it goes against really centuries of Russian cultural development and orientation on Europe. It would be very difficult overnight to replace in the imagination of Russian political and cultural elites Paris with Beijing. So probably they will be pushed back, but generally in the short to mid-term, it would be very difficult for Russia to regain cultural and other markets in Europe, and it will be very difficult to really emancipate itself from the growing Chinese influences today.
Thank you. We had talked about one more topic, but I'll keep that, so to speak, in reserve, because we have reached the time when we should be opening this up to a wider discussion. And I would like to invite Iryna and Vasyl back in for this section. If Vasyl is still here, I understand he may have had to go somewhere else. And we have 2 questions from the audience. Let me just read them before I read them to you. Yeah, so the first question is from Elena R, who identifies herself as a lecturer in translation and interpreting, and as a practicing translator and interpreter. And her question is around things getting lost in translation and problems of translating Ukrainian issues for audiences who are not familiar with the cultural and historical context. So her question is, which sources were most revealing or most difficult to contextualize for readers unfamiliar with Ukraine's history? And how do you see Ukraine's historians, writers, and translators shaping global understanding of its sovereignty and identity in the 21st century? So a question about, how does one talk to audiences outside specialist circles, I guess, and Ukraine itself?
Yes, that's certainly, I agree 100% that a lot of things not just got lost, but really what you see is if the correct context is not provided, there is a possibility of lack of understanding altogether or misunderstanding certain things. And I really had to learn to provide context almost about everything when I started to write for broader audience. That's now, it's almost a must. And if I don't do that, my editors my editors remind me about that I have to explain one thing or another. And for example, with the war, the big war, when it started in February of 2022, the Ukrainian social media networks were full of this parallels with the song, the Soviet song about the start of German war, the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union. About the in the song there was Kiev that was bombed, and it was bombed at 4 a.m. in the morning. And that was a part of the Soviet narrative about the West attacking Kiev. And now what happened, the Russian attack on Kiev around the same time, which was kind of a rhyming with this Soviet narrative and Soviet mythology, and everyone understand what was happening, what was going on. And I at that time wrote op-ed, which eventually was published in Telegraph, and it is included in the collection. And among other things, I had to explain the meaning of that particular timing, the meaning of the part of the Soviet mythology of the Great Patriotic War, so-called Great Patriotic War, and now how it was really sounding in this new context, and what that means really for the Putin slogan about Russians and Ukrainians being one and the same people and one of the same nation. So yeah, unfortunately, there is no other way but just go and explain. And then when some of my work is being published in Ukraine, I get another sort of a criticism that I explain too much. But that's what I guess you have to do. Maybe in Ukrainian versions, the editors have to adopt a very different approach instead of adding, just cutting those explanations.
Right. So you're over-explaining now, overcompensation. That's very funny. Iryna, I think, has a question. So Iryna, do you want to ask it?
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed learning more about how you approach to different interviews and how your understanding change the more that you write about the war and other periods of Ukrainian history. And in this is a new book, David and Goliath. You also have in one of the interviews the questions about how the war affected your interpretation of the past, and you're reflecting on your own positionality and the way how historians we are not used to be emotional, we should be, we are trained to be objective, but you're also reflecting how history and the way how you approach history also changed. So can you explain more about that? What are advantages in looking at the past events when you are a historian and you can immerse yourself and have also emotions and about your writing about the history, and how historians and audience should read such books when we are as a authors historians are trying to be honest with their readers. And yeah, can you tell more how you approach this?
Yes, thank you. On the emotions, I put it as my task really more less emotional kind of a way of talking about these events and more talking to intellect rather than to emotions. And partially because I think that, and we are now in the world where there is a lot of Ukrainian refugees, including in the academic field. And I think that they have these emotions that they're much more legitimate as part of the discussion than something that I would present. Not that I don't have those emotions. Living in the United States and only visiting Ukraine from time to time. So it's about the right to be, to the moral right also to to talk from that position. And that's how I look at that in terms of quote unquote distribution of labor. But related to that issue is the issue, and you mentioned this word, objectivity, right? And I heard that from a number also of people who interviewed me. Can I be really objective, right? I'm a Ukrainian coming from Ukraine, and I deal with that on two levels. First of all, I basically tell right away, and anyone who listens to me, accent and other things, but when I write, you can't see me, you can't hear accent. So the Russo-Ukrainian war starts with telling my personal story about how I woke up and how I called my sister. And so immediately I am honest with who I am, where I'm coming from. I'm not going to hide that. But second, and I believed in that from the start go, I still believe it today, that I don't think that I could take any other moral position and position in terms of objectivity toward any other conflict of that nature. I can't be on the side of Russia, even if I would not come in from Ukraine, given what is happening and how the war started. And I look in that sense at the great historians of World War II, who somehow wrote wonderful objective works without somehow trying to sympathize with Nazism or with Hitler. So I think it's also a little bit double standards when someone is approaching, again, you Ukrainian, you can't be objective on Ukraine. You come from Ukraine, you can't be objective on that history of particular war. If you are French, you can be objective on French history. No one questions that. So I think there is a little bit of a double standard.
I don't know. I would question the objectivity of French history. Anyway. We have a question from Stephen Wheatcroft, whom you might know,
Yes.
former professor in this department, historian of Soviet economy in particular. And he has two questions. One, and they're both connected to the economic factor. So one is about the origins of this war. Was there an economic aspect to the origins of this war? And the second part is about the future. What will Ukraine's economic future be? What will its role be in the world economy? He asks, has Ukraine already sold their mineral wealth to Trump? And are there any other potentially threatening economic deals which Ukraine is sort of strong-armed into during this war, which might impede on its or impinge on its economic future?
Yes, thank you. First of all, on the economic origins of the war, I'm sure that there are economic aspects, and we learn about that when we discuss, let's say, the start of the war after 2014 and the gas in the Black Sea and access to that gas. Certainly also the shale gas in the Donbass region. So what we see, what is being discussed or was discussed at that time is really a loss for Ukraine and gain for Russia. So clearly that economic factor is there. Now, how important it is, I think it is secondary. So that loot that comes with the war and with aggression, I think it's certainly welcome, but it's not the main driving force. The main driving force is political and military, primarily in terms of the reestablishment of the Russian control. And economy gets in through the idea, again, I mentioned already the association agreement with European Union, and the Ukraine joining the Eurasian Union. That's what certainly Putin wanted back in 2012 and 13. Economic factor is there as well, but again, I think that overriding was a political one. Because if Ukraine signs association agreement with European Union, it's not just reorientation of the trade and markets or continuing reorientation, but it's the fact that, like any country that signed association agreement with European Union, that country can't be member of other similar trade bloc or have an association relations with that. So what I'm trying to say is that the economy is there, but again, from where I sit in terms of my analysis, what I see, what I read, I don't think that this is the main factor. Regarding future of Ukraine, and the easy question to answer is about the mineral wealth. No one heard about Ukraine being a particular Klondike for this mineral resources before this debate started. And once the agreement was signed, never heard about Ukraine being reaching those resources either. So from my perspective, again, that was more ideological and political than anything else, with Trump really trying to prove to himself, first of all, that he's not doing anything for free. That would be the biggest sin, of course, in his mind. So but I think that the mineral resources of Ukraine are pretty safe, given the shifts in the rhetoric and in the politics of the United States. In terms of Ukraine's future, I was really shocked by the story of 2022 and 2023, and that Professor Rytkov maybe also will be. I don't know whether you had those thoughts or not, but I was thinking about the famine and Holodomor in Ukraine, but also certainly, as your research shows, the famine in parts of the Russian Federation as well. And the struggling, the Soviet agriculture collectivized partially as the result of the famine, or in the process of that couldn't feed the country up until the very end of the Soviet Union. And then in 2022, 2023, you see Ukraine and Russia being in the midst of the war, and their supply of grain can't now get to Mediterranean, and that endangers and produces threat of famine for Africa and good part of the world. So the countries at war still produce grain for export that the Soviet Union couldn't produce even to feed its own population. So in that sense, again, I think that the Ukraine as an agricultural superpower is still already there, even in the conditions of the war. Ukraine as a potential superpower in terms of IT and technology is almost there, with the drone warfare really now offering expertise and help to the countries in the Middle East, destroying with the drones the army without navy, destroying or defeating the Russian Navy. So it's agricultural and IT sectors. Ukraine is, I think, it's punching above its weight in terms of geopolitics. The future, geopolitical future, which will very much depend on the outcome of this war. One thing that it seems to me quite clear, unless really things change dramatically, but Ukraine has future only outside of the Russian control and only as the result of either European Union or whatever can emerge if European Union gets transformed. The Russian occupational policies in the areas of Ukraine that occupied leave no Ukraine. So it's not even the Soviet Union that tolerated and occasionally even supported the development of languages, recognized Ukrainians as a separate group. So none of that Putin's Russia is doing. So another generation or two on the Russian occupied territories, that will be another story of Kuban with Ukrainian roots, but really no, very little Ukrainian identity. Thank you.
We have two questions about history and the present. One comes from Dmitro Yesipenko, who first thanks you for your talk, and his interest is in connecting your earlier work on the history of religion in Ukraine with the present. In your view, has the current Great War fundamentally and irreversibly changed the situation of division and fragmentation among Orthodox believers in Ukraine? And what are the overall dynamics you see in this space for the future?
Yes, thank you for this question. I think that the war really it's almost doesn't matter how it will end, but the sort of the carnage, the sort of the suffering that it brought clearly killed the idea of Russians and Ukrainians as being part of one and the same nation. So clearly the Ukrainian identity became much more exclusivist. And I don't think that the Russian losses in this war, and they exceed 1 million now, if you count killed and wounded, the estimates are anywhere between 1 million and 1.5 million. So 15,000 were losses in Afghanistan. So it's huge numbers by any standards. And I can't imagine that these body bags that come from Ukraine really deliver the message that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people or their brothers. So if Ukraine is not completely destroyed and Ukrainians are not Russified, that's one potential outcome. But more likely outcome is that really the divisions between Russians and Ukrainians are now really set in stone for generations to come, to a degree that neither the revolution not World War II were able to produce that sort of differentiation. And this is directly linked, of course, to the idea of the religious scene and the Russian Orthodox Church, which is, of course, an institutional embodiment of the idea of one Russian nation. It never changed its coloration in that sense. And from that point of view, it's not surprise that the divisions also and split goes through the Orthodox Church as well, not just through the borders and armies and societies, but certainly the Russian Orthodox Church itself. Again, it's Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate. So two key things happened during this war. The first one was the first ever appearance of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine that has canonicity in the eyes of outside Orthodox world, not linked to Moscow. And this is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the Thomas of Constantinople that was given. So that's a big thing. And in the history of the churches, the horizon we are talking about, it's not 2 years, 5 years, it's centuries. So that's a big shift and big change. So there is a pole, the canonical pole in Ukraine that separates it from Moscow Patriarchate. And the second one came with the start of the all out attack on Ukraine, when the leader of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, Metropolitan Onufriy, really took a position that this is a fratricidal war, and in clear opposition to his superior, Patriarch Kirill. So the division within the church, again, is still ongoing. We don't know where it will bring, but historically speaking, the tendency is clear. And I think, again, in the church history, nothing happens overnight. So I think that that war set the Ukrainian church and vis-a-vis Russian church on a very different trajectory.
Thank you. I know Vasyl wants to ask a question, so I'll give him the floor, and then there's 2 more questions on the Q&A, and then we probably will be at time, but we'll see. Vasyl, please.
Thank you, Mark. Just a quick question, Professor Plokhy. In terms of your Russian colleagues, Russian historians who are part of the democratic countries who are now working at other universities outside of Russia, and maybe even some within Russia, right? Have you been reading some of what they are currently writing about? I mean, and certainly we understand that those who are within Russia probably they do not diverge from the official Kremlin position, but anyways, I mean, and also those who are outside of Russia. I mean, and if you've been following some of their research, who you think is worth reading or worth paying attention to, or you think it's even those Russians who are outside of Russia still continue to kind of trying to explain Russia's war in Ukraine?
Yes, the historians, it's really a very disorganized group of people. So and there are they come in different kinds. So what I can say for those who are outside of Russia, there are people who are really very vocal in not just opposition to the war, but also in the critique of regime, and also in sort of the scholarship that they produce. And some of them, again, I'm giving names who are already in the public. Those people took very public position. Tatiana Tairova-Yakovleva, an expert on Ukrainian Cossack history, the author of the books on Mazepa, the publisher of the most complete collection of Chronicle of Samilo Velichko. So she left Russia. She's taken very clear positions. She didn't really change her position before 2022, but for that reason she had to leave Russia. Recently, last week, Guardian published a long essay by Serhii Radchenko. He's of Ukrainian origins, but he's ethnic Russian from Sakhalin. That's where he grew up. Who just renounced his very publicly Russian citizenship, including went through a very lengthy process of denouncing this citizenship within the Russian legal framework. There are others who basically are silent, and they mostly those are who left Russia before 2022. So they are publicly not taken position. Whether they're not taking position because they don't think that the position that would be popular with their colleagues today, or they don't take position because they have families maybe in Russia and are concerned about them. I just don't know, but there are silent and there are more public figures and personalities. And in Russia itself, people whom I know, again, they a lot of them belong also to the generation that was really formed by Gorbachev's perestroika, right? So that they have liberal roots. And if they didn't leave Russia, many of them left. They went into the kind of internal exile, which very much reminds me about the Soviet Union of the 1970s and 1980s, the first half of the 1980s. And then there are the new incarnation of commissars, some of them with some knowledge of the subject. And the dominant trend there is basically Russian nationalism with imperial overtones. And returning back, Putin, of course, himself is very much, his thinking is rooted in the imperial ideas about unity of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, but also part of all official research on Ukraine today. It's about not Ukraine, it's about Little Russia. You look at the so-called Lineyka of the textbooks, the program that the Russian government is working on now for 15 years, that all the history textbooks from the primary school up until the university have to promote the same sort of ideas. They would discuss Khmelnytsky without mentioning the word Ukraine. There would be either Little Russians or there would be a Cossack uprising. And then there would be Ukraine in the 20th century without Ukrainians. That's the mainstream. That's the official line. That's Medinsky at his best or at his worst. I don't know, but that's the official Russian history and historiography today. Those who disagree really don't have today a platform or freedom of doing that, and try to go to the more esoteric themes and topics that don't directly touch on issues of Russian-Ukrainian relations in particular.
We have a question from Svetlana Yakovenko on translation again. We're going back to translating. And she writes that she's translating and publishing 19th century text on Ukraine for a English-speaking audience. And this is a question about how to deal with Russian terms in regards to Ukraine. So their approach is to explain terms such as Yugo-Zapadny Krai and Mala Rossiya in a translator's editorial note, and then use Ukraine in the main text. So the aim of that, so the kind of the Russian terms for Ukraine are put into editorial note, and Ukraine is used in the text. One aim is to reduce the risk of these terms being taken out of context or misused. And the question is if you consider this an acceptable approach.
It depends what text we are dealing with. So I have experience of one general history of Ukraine. Probably quite a few people know it, The Gates of Europe. And I explained the differences between the terms in the introduction, and then I was talking about Ukraine.
So just to clarify that, So these are 19th century texts, right? So one example is
Right, I understand.
Yevtumenko.
So that's
Yeah.
right. So that's the one approach, but it's a very particular genre, the history of it. Then I have this book that is called the Lost Kingdom, and that's history of Russian nationalism in connection with Ukraine in particular. And there it's very important that Kostomarov uses term Southern Russia when he talks about Ukraine, the Southern Rus, or what term is used by Katkov. Then suddenly it becomes really, because if you take away that terminology, you take away really, it all loses sense at all. So it all depends, again, 19th century text. I think if it's about Ukraine and there are different perspectives and ideas, you have to stick to the terms that are there and provide the editorial note saying what it is, and so you can the confusion is also when it comes to thing that Solzhenitsyn was using to prove that Lviv was Russian in the 19th century, when he was saying that there was Ruska Rada, and translate that as Russian. So that's we certainly can't do. We can't translate Rus or Ruthenia or Ruthenian, Ruski as Russian, because again, then we commit a different sort of the Ukrainskую підлог. So I don't know. We replace one term with another and then completely lose everything in translation. So again, it depends. If these terms are specifically meaningful and important for the particular text, for particular discussion, then we have to just follow what the authors are using. And that's the introductions and notes there for that specific reason, to explain what it is, what is going on. If this is just a definition that has no particular additional meaning and importance and significance, then you have more freedom. But again, still in the introduction or in the note, you would have to explain that I am replacing this and that for this and that reason.
Thank you. We have a question about music. I know we're nearly out of time, but there's two more questions I would like to squeeze in. This is from Julia Schwedt, who is a PhD student at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. And her question is, if there are historical examples you're aware of where cultural forms like music genuinely shape resistance and identity in ways that affect outcomes. Or, she asks, do they mainly operate symbolically?
Everyone who studies the unification of Italy and the rise of Italy as a unified and independent state knows the importance of opera for Italian national movement. It's interesting that it became really more than just Italian phenomenon, as Italian reunification provided an example for Eastern Europe, in particular, for national movements. We found ourselves generally in that part of the world in the situation that your nation building is not complete until you have a national opera, right? So the opera in particular, and again, became a symbol of nationhood. in my opinion, influenced very much by Italian stories. So this is one example. Another example that is now very popular in the United States, it's about the so-called cultural diplomacy and the Carol of the Bells, the Shedrick, as this attempt to really promote Ukraine and Ukrainian culture. The role of Paderewski and in the Poland acquiring its independence or recognition of independence at the Paris Peace Conference. Now it's again a musician rather than music per se is very important as well. So music becomes a part of the nation building and identification and national identity. To the same degree as written texts or the landscape become parts of this national imagination and national identity. Really, it's almost impossible to separate the two, and that's the reason why in Ukraine you have such big battles about the name of the conservatory, whether it should be Tchaikovsky or not. And if it wouldn't matter, there would be no this big battles and big discussions.
Yeah, I wonder if under that understanding, Australia is a fully formed nation, because I'm not aware of a Australian National Opera as a. I mean, not an opera house.
This is a shame, and there are so many Italians in.
But it might just be that
in
I'm
Australia.
ignorant.
That undermines my theory, I guess. Yeah.
Last question before we let you go. It comes from Simon Kohut, and that circles back to the question of writing history of the present and in the present. And he refers to you speaking about the idea that a historian needs to know what happened at the end of the story in order to tell the story properly. Now, he challenges that insofar as he says that in his view, some of the best history writing achieves something different. It connects our understanding of history to the contingency that we experience in our present. So can you comment on whether your work on this war, where the end is not yet known, right, has changed your approach to writing history and your need to know the end? Have you liberated yourself a little bit from needing to know the end?
Yes, I at the end found a number of ways how to kind of legitimize my exercise. Otherwise, if not illegal, then illegitimate in the context of the traditional writing of history. And one of them was based on the idea that the very general cliche sort of definition of what historians do. Allegedly, we study continuity and change in history. And I think you don't need to have know the end of the story to recognize something new. Right, and in this particular case, again, I was talking, for example, about the drone warfare in Ukraine, and this is when it comes to military history and history of technology. This is clearly something new. If you look about the level of exclusivity of Ukrainian identity that comes with the war, this is new. And to recognize the new, you have to recognize what is not new. And for that you have to know history. And it looks like we historians are maybe better equipped to recognize new than others. So that's one maybe way to think about the benefits of writing history at the time when things happen. Again, challenges, but also benefits. And also historians can provide a number of things that are within the realm of traditional history. The origin of the war is probably as old as history itself. So there is nothing genre bending or attempt somehow to completely reshape our understanding of history. That's quite traditional. You can, I talk about Putin's views, I talk about ideology, I talk about imperial, or write about imperial views as well, and that falls in the realm of intellectual history. So again, not something particularly revolutionary. And then you mentioned future, and maybe that's where I conclude my answer, because indeed, when you agreed to do an interview, you have to be ready. That question about the future would be asked. I almost have this suspicion that journalists asking you for interview and pretend that they're interested in history when in reality the whole thing is for that question about the future. And the future shaped contingency is of course very much a big actor in that entire story and has a lot of power. But there are tendencies, and we historians know that can go over a longer period of times, not just decades, sometimes centuries. And we can recognize those tendencies, and we can certainly suggest that they will play a role in the future. Whatever the future will be, we don't know, but we can certainly point to some trends that already we can see, and they will play some role. Maybe small, maybe big, maybe they will define the future. So we can point to some factors. So at the end of the day, I first came with the conclusion that never again I will be writing on something where I don't know the end. On the other hand, I discovered so much by doing that, and think that it is a useful exercise. That this is one of the way of perform our function, our role, our calling as historians by informing people around us and make them better understand where are we at that moment in time. And maybe know the future, but we know the past, and that's already something.
Thank you very much. And we've taken actually more time from you than we told you we would. So thank you very, very much for being with us. Hopefully next time, when we talk about the next book, maybe we'll do that actually in Melbourne. We'll see.
Absolutely.
Thanks also to Iryna and to Vasyl for the opening remarks, and to somebody nobody else can see, Tihin from the IT support for making sure that this actually all works properly. So thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for coming and participating in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you so much to everyone who was involved and helped organize this event. And yeah, next talk in Melbourne.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
See you.
Yeah, goodbye. До побачення.